So we have made it. We are in the final week of Advent. This week we will celebrate Christmas. And so what we've been doing at Wayfarers is we've been looking at that kind of classic manger scene. First, we looked at Mary and Joseph and kind of who they were and what they represented. Then we looked at the shepherds and kind of their lowness, their poorness, their status as kind of the least and outsiders. And we looked at the Magi, um, those who were not followers of God and yet were able to find God through this kind of roundabout way that God is announcing to the entire world that his child has come. And so, this very last week, we're going to look at, I think, a pretty popular passage out of the Bible, one that's not necessarily associated with Christmas, because it doesn't talk about Jesus' birth at all. It, in fact, kind of pulls the scope back and talks about who it is that has been born, who Jesus actually was. And so this is the famous kind of hymn opening of the Gospel of John. So again, John's approach is very different than the other gospel writers. It was likely written much later, 20, 30, 40, or 50 years later, we're not sure. And his assumption is almost that you have read the other gospels. There seems to be many things that he just doesn't really talk that much about, like how Jesus first got disciples. He mentions them by name much after later when he's talked about them. He seems to assume that we know some of these basic stories, and he wants to fill in gaps. He wants to emphasize certain things that are not just reporting the story, but I think reporting some of the meaning of various things. He wants us to think through it this way. And so, where the other gospels kind of start out with this approach where we talk about this baby, we talk about the Messiah, and there's this slow realization throughout the gospel as we read it of who this actually is that is the Messiah. It is God Himself, and that His version of greatness, His version of what it means to be the Messiah, is going to be very different than our understanding. John, on the other hand, just starts out with it right away. I remember reading something once that a guy said his dad's advice was, if you ever get in a street fight, make sure that you get the first punch in, because that'll end most fights if you hit him hard enough. And I feel like that approach is a little bit how John is approaching the gospel, is where the other gospels are kind of hanging back and helping you realize slowly how profound it is that this is God. John just pops you in the mouth with it. We get to deal with that, of the fact that this is God, and yet he's an obscure, misunderstood person this whole time. The rest of the gospel is going to kind of have us nursing that bloody lip in some ways, that, like, how do these pieces fit together? How is this God? How is this obscure, unknown figure? How is this how God came into the world? So I want to read the beginning of John's gospel and look at, again, who is in the manger, who is this baby that we're celebrating at Christmas. I'm going to read from a little different translation. This is called the First Nations Version. It's a translation that is done from a kind of indigenous perspective here in English. It's going to have a couple of quirks. One is going to be that it doesn't translate, names the way a lot of other translations will, which is kind of the way that names are still approached in a lot of American indigenous cultures, right? So, like, my name, Colin, actually means, I think, like strong and young and virile or something like that. And so, rather than me being referred to as Colin in the book, um, I would be that. So, young, strong, and virile showed up and did this thing. So that's one of the quirks. The other thing that I really like that they do in this translation is they kind of use this storytelling tradition, which is very important to the oral tradition, which of course would have been incorporated into the gospel. But a good storyteller, even a story that you know really well, is going to throw in little details. It's going to emphasize things with these kind of little flares. And they do that in this First Nations version. Kind of add these little flares, but they tell you where they are. They show you kind of, here's the actual scripture, the part we translated into kind of modern indigenous idiom, but then they throw in these little things that help them tell the story as an oral storyteller, what it's meant to be read out loud, it's meant to be spoken. And I just think it's a nice way of looking at this kind of sometimes overly familiar passage. So We'll start the Gospel of John. Long ago, in the time before all days, before the creation of all things, the one who was known as the Word was there, face to face with the Great Spirit. This Word fully represents Creator and shows who He is and what He's like. He has always been there from the beginning, for the Word and the Creator are one and the same. Through the Word, all things came into being, and not one thing exists that He did not create. Creator's life shined out from the Word, giving light to all human beings. This is the true light that comes to all the peoples of the world and shines on everyone. The light shines into the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it or put it out. Into the wilderness in the land of promise, or Judea, came a man named Gift of Goodwill, or John. He was sent by the Great Spirit to tell you what he knew about the light so that everyone could believe. He was not the light, but came to speak the truth about the light. The true light that shines on all people was coming into the darkness of this world. He came down into this world, and even though he made all things, the world did not recognize him. Even his own tribe did not welcome or honor him. But all who welcome and trust him receive their birthright as children of the Great Spirit. They are born into a new way, not from a human father's plans or desires, but born from above by the Great Spirit. Creator's Word became a flesh and blood human being and pitched his sacred tent among us, living as one of us. We looked upon his great beauty and saw how honorable he was, the kind of honor held only by this one Son who fully represents his Father, full of his great kindness and truth. Gift of Goodwill, or John, told what he knew about him and cried out in a loud voice, "This is the one I have told you about. He's here. He comes after me, but is much greater, my elder. He has more honor, for even though he is thought to be younger, he existed before I was born." From the fullness of his being, we have all had many gifts of kindness poured out on us. Drawn from the water, or Moses, gave us our tribal laws, but the gift of great kindness and truth came from Creator sets free, or Jesus, the chosen one. No one has ever seen the Great Spirit but the one Son, who is himself the Great Spirit and closest to the Father's heart. He has shown us what he is like. So, in the original language, this word that keeps being referred to, this one who is called the Word, or in this translation, the Great Spirit's own word, John is playing with kind of ideas that were familiar to his original readers that aren't as familiar to us. So this idea of this word, or in the original Greek would have been logos, which is a word a lot of us have heard, was something that would have been associated with God's active presence in the world. So, in the creation, which is very much being quoted here, right? In the beginning is how it says in most translations. God created everything, right? And yet he speaks the world into creation, and so his word is powerful. It's also associated with wisdom. Again and again, we get this idea of God's word, God's acting presence, enlightening people, making the world make sense. The way he has structured and built the world is something that we can enter into as we grow in wisdom as well. It's also kind of a principle and a word that it gets borrowed from Greek philosophy. In Greek philosophy, they had this idea that, something had to have started the motion of the world. And they used this word logos for the places that God kind of touched and tweaked his creation. So in both those cases, Jesus is being compared to this creator, this powerful God. He's being stated that he is a creator, and that he is the way in which God is interacting with the world is kind of the idea of what they're doing there. So he just jams into this small section some really important things. So from this first couple words, we know he was in the beginning. So he was there before everything was made. He's not a created thing. He's not just a man. He's not an angel, something like that. He was there before all of that with God. And he was with God, which means in some way he can be distinguished from God, right? We know that God and the Christ are not exactly the same thing. Sometimes we use the language of God the Creator, or God the Father, or the Great Spirit in this translation. to show that there is some separation there. It's not just one God kind of functioning in different ways, etc. And yet he was God. And so this kind of tension that he is God and is with God is one that people are going to be wrestling with, the next several centuries after he's born, trying to figure out how exactly this works, that he was both God. And that's where this idea of the Trinity comes from, that God is one and God is three. Confusing, heady stuff. But again, it's that initial blow that we are not just talking about a good prophet, a good teacher, an inspiring figure. We are talking about someone who designed and created the world, coming down to live in the world. And the way the world is described is a very realistic description of the tragedy that is this world. God made the world good, and humanity broke it. And so the world is no longer described as light and whole. It is described as darkness. It is described as broken. And yet, Jesus does not seem defeated by this. Again and again, we hear that he is the light that is going to overcome, right? It is not going to be put out, despite the fact that the world is very dark. And we see this again and again in Jesus' ministry. I mean, the culmination of all the Gospels is the cross. The absurd idea that God, in his goodness and in his wholeness, comes to live among us, and we killed him for it. We tortured him. We allowed him to break his very self, right? Separating God from God, Father from the Son, because it is so awful, because the world is so dark. And yet the cross is what Jesus uses, what God uses to fix things. Instead of it breaking the power of God, instead of it breaking God himself apart, it breaks the power of death, it breaks the power of sin. It begins the process of healing and restoration. The world can become what it was meant to again, though Jesus will, of course, bear the scars for that world. But that is not all that John is going to emphasize. One of his favorite metaphors is this kind of pun that even works in English of a darkened mind versus an enlightened one, right? We are not just broken to the point we cannot comprehend God, we cannot learn from him. He is redeeming us and enlightening our minds, making it possible to comprehend God and his ways and strike out in a different direction than the world is always offering us. We see Jesus again and again putting his hands on this deeply flawed and broken world and healing and restoring. We see this with blind people. We see this with outcasts. We see this with anyone who is willing to take a different direction and enjoy peace and wholeness and fullness that does not cost violence, that does not cost it to somebody else, right? It's a completely different way of being in the world. And yet this brokenness and this loss that we constantly feel is not the true story. That is not what the gospel says. God is taking it and he is doing something different with it. And one of the most important things we get from this passage is, again, no one is seeing God except Jesus himself, the closest to the Father's heart. He has shown him what he is like. And I think to this day, we do not take this seriously enough. We continue to have this stereotype as God as this kind of grumpy guy with a big white beard who's just kind of mad at us and wishing we would try a little harder all the time, right? That is not who Jesus was. That is not who God is revealed to be in Jesus. God is someone who loves the world profoundly in all of its darkness, so much that he has no intention of leaving it that way because it hurts too much to love the world. He comes and experiences life in all of its pain and frustration. He allows all the pain and death and sin into himself that he can overcome it and heal it, right? This is a God who loves the world so much he will die and bleed for it, as he will do for many individuals who no one else cares about and no one else will pay attention to. We see who God is in this. God is not distant. God is not uncaring. He's not grumpy and petty. He is deeply loving in a way that we really can't even understand. We tend to think of love as just really feeling strongly about liking something. God's version of love is bleeding and becoming And taking on pain, he doesn't have to, so things can be better, so we can grow and heal back into this wholeness and this thing that we were meant to be. And so, this beautiful, beautiful story of the Creator coming as a son, as an innocent baby, a light in the darkness, is what we celebrate at Christmas. So I want to read this one more time. I want us to just hear this story one more time. But here's what I want us to do this time. Take just a second to think about what that darkness either looks like in your life. Maybe it's just some deep pain. It's some deep ways you have been wronged. Maybe it is something that is wrong in the world that just makes you feel sick. Maybe it's war, or maybe it's children who are facing hunger or abuse. Maybe it is homelessness. Maybe it is depression. There's something in your world, whether yours or in the world, that is real and true darkness that comes from this broken world. And I want you to put yourself, there's another character in the story if we listen closely, and that is John the Baptizer, as we hear him called in other gospels, right? And he has one very specific job in here. It's not to heal the world. It's not to fix all that is broken. It's not even, to follow well. It's simply to witness, to point out the light is come and things are being renewed. And so in here, I want you to put the darkness that you feel closest to and hurt by the most right now, into this story and see what God does to it. I also want us to listen for our participation. When John talks about what God is up to in the world, that is our invitation and our job as well. So I'm going to read it one more time, listening to this story of hope, this story of what it is we are celebrating in one of the darkest times of year, the light coming among. So long ago, in the time before all days, before the creation of all things, the one who is known as the Word was there, face to face with the Great Spirit. This Word fully represents Creator and shows who He is and what He is like. He has always been there from the beginning, for the Word and the Creator are one and the same. Through the Word all things came into being, and not one thing exists that He did not create. Creator's life shined out from the Word, giving light to all human beings. This is the true light that comes to all the peoples of the world and shines on everyone. The light shines into the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it or put it out. Into the wilderness of the land of promise, or Judea, came a man named Gift of Goodwill, John, or you. He was sent by the Great Spirit to tell what he knew about the light, so that everyone could believe. He was not the light, but he came to speak the truth about the light. The true light that shines on all people was coming into the darkness of this world. He came down into this world, and even though he made all things, the world did not recognize him. Even his own tribe did not welcome and honor him, but all who welcome and trust him receive their birthright as children of the Great Spirit. They are born into a new way, not from a human father's plans or desires, but born from above by the Great Spirit. Creator's Word became flesh and blood human being, and he pitched his sacred tent among us, living as one of us. We looked upon his great beauty and saw how honorable he was, the kind of honor held only by this one Son who fully represents his Father, full of his great kindness and truth. Gift of Goodwill, or John, told what he knew about him and cried out with a loud voice, "The one I have told you about is here. He comes after me, but is much greater, my elder. He has more honor, for even though he is thought to be younger, he existed before I was born. From the fullness of his being, we have all had many gifts of kindness poured onto us. Drawn from the water, or Moses, gave us our tribal laws, but the gift of great kindness and truth came from Creator Sets Free, or Jesus, the Chosen One. No one has ever seen the Great Spirit, but the one Son, who is himself the Great Spirit and closest to the Father's heart. He has shown us what he is actually like. And so that light in the darkness, God coming among us and healing all things, is what we celebrate at Christmas. It's both something that happened in the past, it is something that was going to come into its fullness at the end of history. This is what we celebrate. So, happy Christmas, everyone.